Alright, in this video I'm going to go over how to design a story package, or a module, some people call it. It's basically when you bring together all the elements of a story that are going to be on a page and you get them all in one place. So that could be a photo or a visual, the story, the headline, captions, cut lines, photo credits, the photo byline, uh, or even subheads, and of course the endnote. And all of these things are going to be part of what I call a complete story package, and that's each page is made out of a number of packages or modules, and you kind of need to move those around or form them. But the first thing you have to do is learn how to assemble a module, and that's what I'm going to go over in this video. So I want to create this first package, just a little 3-column story grid, or a 3-column story on this grid, and I have a photo that's going to go with it. That's obviously going to need a caption, and it's going to need a byline or a credit line as well. So to start that out, I'm going to get the photo and the text together. So this photo needs to go in the text. If you remember the last video, we talked about setting up the text to fill these 3 columns here. This is that same text box technique, so you can use that, and then you got to wrap your photo as well. So this photo is wrapped so that it will push the text aside. And of course add a 7/5 stroke to that. A lot of times it will default to 1 or 0, but we always keep ours at 0.75. Now you notice that this photo here doesn't have a cut line or a caption or a photo credit. So what I like to do typically before I add the photo to the story is I make that cut line and that credit and group it with the photo so that it moves as one unit. And how you're going to do that is I like to zoom in because it's a little bit of a smaller object, so you want to make sure you have a good view of it. And I just draw a thin little text box about the size of the length of the photo, and that's where your caption is going to go. Now for our paper this year, this might be changed depending on when you're watching this in the future. But for now in 2021, 2022, our captions are the Helvetica font. You should have installed that or had it installed on your computer already. Most computers have it by default. And it's going to be size 8 point. So you can go ahead and write a caption. In this case, I'm just going to fill it with placeholder text. Most captions, that's a pretty long caption, I'd say. Maybe a couple lines. But most importantly, all captions have to be, the last line has to go past the halfway mark of this story. So if the caption was that long, that wouldn't be okay because you're leaving an awful lot of space to the right and it's just empty. So you want to make sure your caption always goes more than halfway across. In this case, it could go all the way to the end, it could go almost to the end, or it could just barely make halfway. But in this case, I'll leave it right there. And once you have that caption, I would size down the text box to be just how you want it. And that caption is going to go below the photo. Now, the next part you're going to need is the photo credit. So for our photo credits, it's pretty much the same as making a caption. You just make another thin text box, except this time the font size is going to be 6. So the font is still Helvetica. The font size is 6 point. And you're going to type in the name of whoever took that photo, drew that piece of art, or made this infographic. So if I use my name here, and you always want to add 10 degrees of italics to photo credits, just to make them stand out from the caption a little bit more, so that if the reader sees those two, they're rather close together, you can tell which one's which. Some newspapers might say photo by, or photo credit. For us right now, we're just going to do just the name of whoever is responsible for that piece. I think it's a little bit simpler, but that could be subject to change in the future, so it depends on your newspaper standards of whatever year you're watching this in. But the other important part about photo credits is that they are right aligned, and it's pretty much the only thing in the entire paper that's going to be right aligned, and that's just to make sure it starts on the opposite side as the caption or cut line so that you don't confuse the two. And the way you're going to do that is just select the text. Up here in our text alignment settings we used earlier, you're just going to select right align. And that cut line can pull down a little bit, and you want the photo credit to be above the cut line and below the photo. And a lot of the times you'll set it in and it'll look okay. I always want to make sure I zoom out and I press W to turn off that grid and make sure that it looks okay at 100% zoom. So how it would look in real life. And I'd say this looks okay. This is a little blurry on the screen, but in real life it'll look a little bit crisper. I'd say this looks okay. You have an adequate space. I believe I did list an actual space in the Google Doc, about half a pica or so. You can measure it out, but most of the time, if something looks good to your eye, it probably looks good when it's going to print. And if it doesn't look good, then chances are you've probably got something that doesn't look too good. And an example of that would be like if I put this photo credit way too close to the photo, and I put this cut line too close to the photo credit. Once I zoom out back to a normal zoom, I'm just going to leave it at 150 because it's a rather big screen. Those two start to bleed together a little bit too much, and then it's going to be a little ugly and confusing. So you want to make sure there's an adequate space between them. In this case, the way we laid it out the first time, this looks pretty good to me. Now, make sure you wrap your cut line so that it also pushes the text out of the way, because you want it to displace it so you can see the text. And I also like to leave a little bit of extra space so that the text of the story doesn't start immediately after the cut line and they don't bleed together. So I make a little bit of extra space, you text wrap it, and you text wrap the photo credit as well. And once I have this kind of photo package created with the cut line, credit, and photo, I highlight it all, and that's when you right click. You can do Controller Command G to group, or right click and click group, and that's going to group it together so that when you move it, it's all going to move as one unit instead of separately, and that just makes things a little bit easier to manage when you have a lot of things on your page. So now that we have our photo unit set up, I'm going to wrap that so that it will push the text out of the way, and you can kind of set that into your story package here that you're creating. In this case, it's going to be in the top right of this text block, and you'll notice that it displaces the text, and it's going to create this little red plus sign. You can kind of see it at the end of this this text box, and that plus sign tells you that there's extra text in the box that is not being displayed because the box is too small. And this doesn't matter here because it's placeholder text, but in a real story setting, you would have to find a way to get that story to fit either where you want it, or the easier route is just to make it a little bit bigger and make room for that text until you can see the end of it and it stops displaying that little plus sign. And a way, sometimes, if you have just a little bit too much text, sometimes you can remedy that by increasing or decreasing the metrics. And metrics is the amount of space between each letter and each word. And so you can change that up here where it says metrics, and this metric below the metrics box is the actual value of the spacing between the letters. And you can change that, but you can't make it above 30 or below -30. Otherwise, the letters start to touch and it becomes unpleasant to read and difficult to read. So typically, if you move it down to +10 or up to +10 or down to -10, that's barely noticeable. 30 would be the absolute limit because then they start to get really close. But that can net you a fair bit of space. So if I have too much text here and I need to fit it in this space, there's absolutely no compromising. I can bring the metrics down -10, and now you can see the words are a little closer together, but they're still legible. You can tell what it says. And I've also gained back a little bit of space here, and now I can see the end of my story. And now in this case I do have a little bit of extra space, but you can usually remedy that by changing the size of the text box a little bit, or even taking the story, adding a little bit or subtracting a little bit to it. That is also a great way to fill space or to gain space, is to alter the story a little bit. You might want to ask the author, or if you're the author, you could do that at your own liberty. But in this case, I think this looks okay. Now, the next part of a story package is the byline. Every story gets a byline except for the editorial. And a byline is just to tell you who wrote the piece, and we put their Twitter handle so that if somebody is interested, they can contact the writer. And the way you do that is every template comes pre-made with one of these byline templates. So you shouldn't have to worry about creating it. You can just hover over it, press Control C for copy and Control V, and now you have a copy of it that you can use for the story. Change the name to whoever wrote the story, so let's say John Adams wrote this story, and you could add his Twitter handle, JAdamsCT. However you wanted to include their handle. Most handles should be first name or first initial last name CT, but you always want to check with the author before you print it. So now that you have your byline, you can select it, make sure it's wrapped to push the text out of the way, and that goes right before the first paragraph. And you're going to notice that that displaces some of the text as well. And so now we've got a plus sign down here. Of course, in this case, I can just increase the size of the text box a little bit, and that works all right. And you'll notice here that the space between the bottom of the byline and the top of the text is a little too small. You really can't differentiate clearly, and the space should be about half a pica. And you can achieve that just by double-clicking into this group and clicking this text box, this lower text box, and just increasing the size a little so that you get a little bit of extra space. You can measure it if you want to on 100% zoom so that you get it exactly, but as long as you get close, it should look alright. And that provides a nice little space before the start of the story, and our end is still exactly where it needs to be. Now, just like with the captions, the end of the story does need to go halfway across. I would count this as halfway across, so that's alright. And at the end of the story, you always include the end note. And the end note is just a little bit of a closer to let the reader know the story's over, and it's just a little fun thing we do in the newspaper. And you place that end note at the very end, the bottom right of that story. You never want to place it inwards toward that center, because that's not perfectly aligned with the edge of the story, and you get some kind of awkward mid-column endnotes. So you always want to make sure it's in the bottom right, in line with the last line of text. And you can adjust the endnote a little more finely by clicking on it, using the arrow keys while zoomed in, and that can help you get the exact placement to make sure that the endnote's right in line with the text. So now we have our story package laid out to this point. I'm going to move that byline out of the way. And the next thing we need to do is add a headline to this story. To make a headline, it's just the same as making any other text box, it's just going to be bigger. And there's no official dimension or size for headlines. You always just want to make sure it fits the page and it fits the story. So besides just conveying information to the reader, a headline also serves as a way to break up a page, because again, you want to have multiple points of entry. You can't have just walls of text. A headline serves as an entry point that creates a gap or a point in the page where you break up the text. It creates a physical separation and makes each story its own individual part. And that headline needs to be a larger size, or at least proportional to the story, to get that effect. And so there's no universal size. It's really up to the designer. In this case, this would be the first story on the page, so I have quite a bit of freedom in designing that headline. So first you would want to increase it to the size you want. Again, that's flexible. You could put it up at 24. For this one, I'll start at 36. And our headline font is going to be Butler Regular. For this year, you can select that, and now you have a font. So you could just do sample headline. I'm just going to fill it with some placeholder. So I have a headline, and just like the other text box, headlines should always be at least halfway across. That's probably still stretching it. Even if it's halfway across, you would want to make sure it's about to this point or farther. So if you needed, sometimes you can wordsmith, add words, subtract words, play around with the sizing. In this case, I think the easiest option would be just to size it up a few notches so that it reaches all the way across the story. Now, some headline fonts can get overwhelming if you make them too big, so you don't want to make the font or the headline the overwhelmingly dominant piece of the page unless you want it to be the single most important thing on the page. So you want it to kind of fit with the story, and that really depends on the other stories on your page. But for this case, I think this headline font is okay, so I would size it down to fit it. And you always want to have 1 pica between the headline and the start of the page. So you can measure that out. If you desire, eyeballing it tends to work all right. So that's about 1 pica, and there you have a complete story package. As you can see, if we zoom out, that's how it would look on a page. You have your photo, caption, story, and your headline. In some stories, you could have multiple photos. You could add other elements like a pull-out quote, or maybe you have a cutout on your page. But this is kind of the most basic story package that you can create. And to assemble a whole page, you have a number of modules that come together to create this whole page experience. That's going to be it for this video. In the next video, we have a couple of other design elements. But once you know how to make a story package like this, that's the fundamentals of working with InDesign just to create the Central Times page. And the skills you have up to this point should be able to get you started.